us to engage with one another. So today we're joined by colleagues and friends, not just from the University of Alberta and Edmonton, but also from across Canada, the United States, Europe, the United Kingdom, Israel, New Zealand, and Australia. So that's the sweet, and now for the bitter. As many of you know, the University of Alberta has been hit by a historic and devastating budget cut of a scale that is unprecedented in North America. The university is responding through a radical reorganization that will see the restructuring of faculties and departments. So this is very likely the last year that the Dallas Cullen Lecture will be hosted by the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. While the program will persist, the department likely will not. And this is a huge loss to us. So today, I'm thinking about the work of a generation of feminist scholars who fought to institutionalize women's and gender studies at the University of Alberta. As one of Dallas's friends commented to me, she would have been so excited by the topic of this lecture. In her final years of teaching in our program, Dallas piloted a popular class where students explored third wave and post-feminism. Dallas was committed to creating conversations across generations of feminists. She was energized by the contributions of young feminists, and she was deeply opposed to the barriers that waveism poses. Now I'd like to turn to Anne Thomas. Anne is a recent graduate of our MA program in Gender and Social Justice. Anne returned to school as a mature student after a career running a number of successful businesses. She completed an undergraduate degree in human ecology with distinction while working 2 jobs and as a sole caregiver of 2 children. As she described her own journey into graduate school, I started an MA from a space marked by ageism, co-constituted and consolidated the imbricated systems of sexism, racism, ageism, compulsory heterosexuality, and able-bodiedness reproduce one another. It was Anne who nominated Dr. Gullette as the Dallas Cullen Lecturer and who introduced me to her nuanced work on ageism and intersectionality. So thank you, Anne, for introducing our speaker.
Thank you, Lise. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us today. I welcome all of you, and most particularly Dr. Margaret Morganroth Gullette. Dr. Gullette is a scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University, an international advisor and editor, an award-winning writer in pedagogy and education, cultural gerontology, and age studies. I could easily restate the awards and recognition that she has earned, but I'm going to talk about why she became one of my scholarly crushes. I am speaking today as a student, but I read Dr. Gullette's books for guidance and found a reliability of thought, a steadfastness of conviction, and a legibility in theory. Her book, Declining to Decline, Cultural Combat and the Politics of Midlife, was the cure for my own crisis of middle age, precipitated by being 2 to 3 years older than my undergraduate cohort. Through this book, I learned that being older did not define my potential. In her iconic book, Aged by Culture, a Pulitzer Prize nominee, it was the antidote for the biological essentialism that I found in so many theories of aging. I read Age-Wise, Fighting the New Ageism in America, and recommended it to my daughter, who was interested in emergency medicine. As a future doctor, I thought it was important that she read Gullette's analysis of Katrina's devastation in New Orleans, and how that particularly impacted the oldest among them. Dr. Gullette did not put down ageism in one phrase only to pick it up with the next. She earned my trust as I explored my own feminist gerontology, partially because of her careful use of language. For ageist language invisibly spreads ageist thinking. Morganroth Gullette makes a clear differentiation between age Ageism, and Aging. And although age is an empty variable, Morganroth Gullette writes in her prize-winning book, Ending Ageism, or How Not to Shoot Old People, that aging is the process that, whatever else it is, serves as a trigger for ageism. The experiences of aging may be the exemplar of intersectional study. She writes, ageism is the least censored, most acceptable, and unnoticed of the cruel prejudices. When the term ageism was coined in 1969, many problems of exclusion appeared to be resolved by the government programs like the Canada Pension Plan, but are now considered by many to be parasitical social benefits. Ageism can be murderous, yet, as she writes, we cannot choose not to be old. The COVID-19 pandemic is acting as an X-ray exposing the deeper flaws of our social and economic structures, the gaps previously ignored or denied in our current political discourse. Dr. Morganroth Gullette, her talk today entitled Instead, How Ageism Worsens in the Pandemic, a Society Sickens Morally When It Thinks of Some of Its Members as Doomed, centers around these concerns. And while it's wonderful that the talk is global, but I'm going to just think locally for a moment. In the example of the Good Samaritan Nursing Home, the site of my first full-time job, and also the site where there are 31 COVID-related deaths. In the resulting class action suit, it reads like a litany of failures. Premier Jason Kenney sloughs off these deaths by saying that they were past the so-called average life expectancy, as if to say no harm, no foul, and no unavoidable loss. Those made more vulnerable to the pandemic can become the least protected, or worse, they may be seen as a bearable sacrifice. Margaret, I'm among the many who are delighted to have you here today, to hear your timely talk. I'm not at all embarrassed that I'm completely fangirl, and I'm delighted to be in the same Zoom room as you. And it's with tremendous excitement that I ask all of you to join me, however silently, in welcoming Dr. Margaret Morganroth Gullette to the University of Alberta for the Dallas Cullen Memorial Lecture.
Well, thank you, Anne. That was a wonderful introduction to my talk, and it makes me feel so grateful that this field is growing so fast and with so many brilliant people in it, and that we continue to read some of the older books. I mean, age studies does not have a long history, but it's long enough so that some could be forgotten, and I'm glad that that's not happening. The expansion of this field, I hope, will go on and change the attitudes towards aging, the field itself, the theorizing of the field, and also, I must say, I hope that there will be more passion in the field. Dallas Cullen. It's a great honor to be giving the Dallas Cullen Lecture. She was a brave and imaginative woman, thinker, feminist, a stalwart. And it's a great honor to be given the talk under this aegis. I'm sorry she's not here. So welcome to my house, and thank you all for welcoming me into your houses. I have long known that my material can be grim, and hate and indifference are. So I invented a goddess, a crone goddess of age justice, whom I call Senexa. May I have the first slide? Yes, there she is. Some of you will recognize her as Michelangelo's Libyan Sibyl. The Libyan Sibyl is the oldest of the Sibyls, and so she seemed to me appropriate to be the crone goddess of age justice. I named her Senexa. You'll see that she's been made to look more Libyan, and and also that unlike Michelangelo's original, she has gray hair. So the second slide. Of the many brutal social biases exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, none needs stricter scrutiny right now than the outbreaks of ageism. Since a fully diverse group ages into later life, ageism intimately subsumes all the social biases: sexism, racism, classism, dementism, ableism. The disproportionate deaths of all the older people concerned not only bring grief to family who lose loved ones in appalling circumstances. Properly analyzed, these deaths also deliver the shock of discovering how many losses were untimely, unnatural, and unnecessary, caused by ageist neglect or violent prejudice. COVID was an atrocity-producing situation, and it still is. And it may take time to comprehend the atrocity. The third slide, please, Juliana. And I'll just read the end of it. The first phase to mid-March 2020. And we just need to hold them long enough for people at home to read it. In 5 short, nope, we're not ready for that one yet. Just, we could have me. In 5 short months of 2020, the responses to COVID-19 sharply worsened already existing ageism. Ageism is not, parenthetically, a universal transhistorical phenomenon. Each era of ageism emerges out of its own specific conditions. And like sexism and racism, it legitimates its own evils and it targets its particular group of victims. This essay of cultural criticism highlights the novelties of the brutal recent escalation. But the worst 2020 flare-ups of the new COVID era were layered over older biases. In Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, La Peste, Camus described the disease politically as thrusting up to the surface the abscesses and pus that up until then had been doing their work internally, thus bringing to notice the hidden truths of a corrupt world. The coronavirus care crisis certainly revealed hidden truths about ageism. In the US, the Trump government's response to the pandemic was reluctant, belated, and inadequate. The failures are often attributed to incompetence and denial of science, but ageism may explain more. From the date of the first US deaths on February 26 in Washington state through mid-March, the media focused on the wildfire numbers in a nursing home. On March 18th, the Seattle Times was already reporting statistics that focused on old people, but only as a high percentage of the dead. About 1/4 of the coronavirus fatalities in the US have been linked to nursing homes. The disease is especially dangerous for the elderly. Now, effective responses might have been better if the first victims had been children instead. In the US, the Center for Disease Control might then have quickly received its banished funding to provide tests, masks, and contact tracing. Preventive measures might have been taken as widely as they were in the polio epidemic of the 1950s. Almost everything that should have happened would have happened. Instead, in this crucial interpretive period, the media obsessively hardened attention on the statistics of those dying in nursing homes, rather than on the conditions in the facilities. When the old are suddenly made visible, they can collapse into a faceless and worse, a voiceless mass. But that blurred mass may still be gendered unconsciously. Even though in the US men have been dying more than women, the stereotypical old woman, since she notoriously lives longer, may be the singular object brought to mind. In any case, this focus on death in such locales added to an already repugnant image of nursing homes as warehouses spatially excluded from the communities that surrounded them. 4, precisely, old women, low-income adults, and seniors with cognitive impairments residing in buildings that, quote, wouldn't pass the sniff test. President Trump early knew the virulence of the new contagion, as journalist Bob Woodward revealed in Rage. Trump, too, must have believed that the inevitable deaths from the deadly new contagion would be merely of such old people. This inexorability is the only plausible explanation of his nonchalance and willingness to downplay the danger. Slide 4, please, Juliana. The term for such behavior is geronticide, defined here as abandoning these older people, or all older people, to death. Ageism thus contributed from the beginning to the stunning, inexcusably high incidence of deaths in long-term care residences, and the extra deaths of people at all ages, and the closures of the economy, and drastic unemployment. Much of the disaster could have been avoided had timely public health measures been taken in that chilling early period of 2020, when Americans were told that the virus would miraculously disappear. The relentless early focus on the mortality of old people also led to an absurd and dismaying belief that non-old people did not need to worry. The public health danger was thus made to seem negligible. As early as March 2020, Nina Cohn, professor of law at Syracuse University, wrote that those who wanted to persuade politicians and the public to take the virus seriously needed to emphasize, as the Washington Post did, it isn't only the elderly who are at risk from the coronavirus. This essay starts to explain the most damning and perplexing belief of all, as the president of the British Society of Gerontologists, Thomas Scharf, put it in June 2020, that, quote, old people's lives appear not to matter. Although only 4.5% of Americans over 65 reside in nursing homes or resided in nursing homes, not more than 1.4 million people. By the spring of 2020, about 30% of the US dead came from that minute subgroup. In Canada, as of late May, long-term care residents accounted for 81% of COVID-19 deaths. In my home state, Massachusetts, as of April 2020, the number under 30 who had died was 1, while the number over 70 was 1,574. Despite the popular wisdom, such deaths were preventable. Slide 5, please. In a small Baptist-run West Baltimore, Maryland nursing home, whose low-income residents were people of color, some of whom must have had pre-existing conditions, as late as June 18th, no one had even become infected. There, as in some homeless shelters, everyone was protected by best practices, instituted early and with the greatest goodwill. The director, Reverend Derek DeWitt, is a hero of our time. Ageist ableism blinded observers to biogerontological facts. I was slow also about this. Being old and even contracting the virus need not be a death sentence. In a Yale public health study of nursing homes, although 28% of residents tested positive, 600 people, only 11.7% went on to acquire symptoms. Many people over age 65 recover, among them super survivors like Sylvia Goldshow, a resident who had also survived the 1918 flu. Residents are rarely interviewed, but on this occasion, USA Today quoted Ms. Goldshow saying of her family, "They knew that I was a wonder. I met their expectations." I think we can close that. Thank you. Choosing congregate living is not by itself a sign of being near the end of life. It's a new home. People whose families adore them move there. Many people stay temporarily for rehab. People with chronic conditions or disabilities may enjoy long lives there. Age does matter disproportionately in reckoning older deaths, however, extra deaths, because many deaths resulted from neglect, and some of it was criminal. In the Veterans Home in Holyoke, Massachusetts, whose practices caused a scandal and now indictments, infected people with cognitive impairments were herded together with others who were not yet infected. More people would have survived in long-term care in long-term facilities, if these had been well regulated beforehand. As in Baltimore, responsible managers would have started testing, paying exploited aides more fairly, and protecting their clients with skilled nursing care, PPE, and physical distancing. Healthy people who had signed do not resuscitate orders, just on the off chance, might never have needed them. And the concept of geronticide can help explain the abnormally high mortality rates state by state, just as it does the federal government's inaction. Geronticide is a human rights violation and a violation of equal rights established by the US Constitution. Even though death tolls were simultaneously mounting in urban communities of color, also disproportionately, it took much longer for the media and public health officials to notice race, class, ethnicity. Many within this vast second group were midlife and older people, many on low incomes. These older adults, constrained to live in cramped multi-generational households, especially in high-rent cities, are often forced out to work by poverty and fear of homelessness. Many families find it difficult to take precautions or isolate those who are sick. But specifically protecting community dwellers of the workforce, however essential they are, was also neglected. Slide 6, please. Yes, racism and classism lessen life chances. Come the epidemic, suddenly life chances meant better or worse odds of literal survival. Some communities were hit by the Black Plague. As of May 2020, the mortality rate for Black Americans was 2.4 times higher than the rate for whites, and 2.2 times higher than the rate for Asians and Latinos. Only Indigenous people whose health service has long been underfunded were worse off. In times of extreme confusion and panic, prejudice is more dangerous to everyone whom society has left vulnerable. Oddly, I noticed that news stories tended to segregate information about the two vulnerable groups, the old in congregate living versus people in the community, many with pre-existing conditions, as if they were distinct, as if people of color didn't live in nursing homes, as if people at home were all healthy and working. On the contrary, as the CDC noted, 53% of those at greater risk were below 60 years of age. They live with serious chronic conditions, including cardiovascular and pulmonary disease, and diabetes, and asthma, and hypertension. And many people in their 20s already suffer from these. Once we conclude that older deaths, or that many deaths, were preventable and premature, we need a stronger concept than the gross statistical one of excess. Writing about missing women in misogynistic societies, Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen called those extra deaths, not excess, but extra. Extra deaths in the pandemic are not countable, but they are enormously significant. The concept of extra deaths, like my initial thought experiment about children, points to various overlapping discriminations on the part of those with power. Power to report the truth and power to save. A startling new ageist construct, a startling new ageist stereotype was being constructed. Not only that only old people, whatever age that meant, die, but that we live mainly in nursing homes, are dependent and frail, and are ipso facto impaired to the point of, quote, dementia, unquote. The emphasis on chronological ages in the news stories, 80, 70, 60, in the warnings about those at highest risk, implied that all adults in later life were, quote, close to death already, an idea that would have been foreign to Sylvia Goldsoul, 108 years old, in her New Jersey nursing home. In a mere 2 or 3 months, all of us above a certain age had become those who tend to die. This false belief, creating hopelessness that rescue is possible, undermines the human urge to value and to try to rescue. To construct older people as a unique group of moritori, several causes converged. The media focus on deaths in nursing homes instead of on residents who survived or on people outside, also at high risk, also including those under 60 with pre-existing conditions. The failure of state health departments to provide disaggregated demographic data by race and gender and locale. We still don't have gender data in the United States about the dead in nursing homes, which left age as the single focus for too long. The journalist segregation of the two most vulnerable groups. The media failed in another way. What clinched the image of old people as those who are about to die was that the voices of care home residents most at risk of geronticidal neglect were scarcely ever heard. Through effective storytelling, the media could have humanized individual adults instead of representing them en masse in graphs and percentages as mortality statistics. The media reported many other touching first-person stories, including from prisoners also locked in, but rarely stories of these older adults quarantined or ailing alone or having recovered, stories told by themselves. Do journalists misperceive those 1.4 million people as unable to express themselves? Sexism, given how many in nursing homes are women, ableism, neuroageism or dementism, and classism, given how many are on Medicaid, compounding ageism may explain why family members and administrators were typically interviewed instead. Geronticide needs its own history, how attacks begin, accumulate, become explicit, work subconsciously, direct conduct, explain discourse, hide truth. Ageism makes many take for granted the phenomenally high rates of death of a particular group. These marked the first new layers of COVID-era ageism. Other new layers followed. All this happened rapidly before mid-May, when my analysis mostly ends. May was Older Americans Month. Slide 7. The speed with which ageism developed certainly built on existing hostilities, but the new ageism of the COVID era strikingly overturned one of the fundamental aspects of the pre-COVID era in the United States, the belief in some prominent quarters that we who are old and sick, far from being likely to die, were likely to live too long. It was still in 2019 the proud age of longevity. Fear of our tenacious lifespans came from many sources, but was often expressed in the mainstream as worry about the cost of treating us under Medicaid and Medicare. Vehemently countered, but widely held, was the feeling that the older a person, the more useless expensive treatment would be. This indifference to our well-being had become so common, not only in churlish Reddits and trollish tweets, but also in signed articles in respectable publications. one of them, in a 2013 New York Times op-ed column called "On Dying After Your Time," a known bioethicist, Daniel Callahan, emphasized the costs of medical care for older people, sliding in the word unsustainable. And if healthy enough to work, they took jobs away from the young. That is why he wrote, "Our duty may be to let death have its day." Ageism takes weird and irrational forms. Until COVID-19, the cult of youth had been relatively limited, mainly to employers' job preferences, men's sex preferences for younger women, broad attempts to pass for younger at work, and politically motivated generational warfare, like boomer bashing. Lethal ageism meant only wishing us dead, not assuming that older people would naturally die off in an epidemic. That form of pre-COVID hostility had also been based on data, but it relied on estimates of how many more very old people would be alive in, okay, name a year like 2050, and what dollar amount maintaining our health would then cost. Rather like Nazi math in German schools, this data implied that instead of being celebrated in the era of the new longevity, the old were going to be too sizable a share of the population for the well-being of the rest. Even scholars who had been familiar with the demographic shift for decades and should have known better provided the same sinister math, graphs, time projections, and scary language. The US Census Bureau harped on dependency ratios. The Pew Research Center likened population aging to a tsunami. Okay, there were also patriotic advocates of rationing healthcare to older people on the basis of quality adjusted life years, asserting the greater value of non-old, able people. In sum, past some chronological age thought to be too old, we ought to have been absenting ourselves. Instead, because of medicine, public health, the long plateau of healthy aging, and the success of the disability movement, we could and did stubbornly persist. To solve the national problem, we would have to want to avoid old age on our own through the duty to die. Everyone listening was hustled in that masochistic direction from many sides. Writers often made old age seem repellent, certainly Alzheimer's. Quite young people said aloud, "Kill me before I get like that." And gerontologists, sociologists, other ethicists, and humanists had opposed the duty to die, no question. A consciously anti-ageist side had struggled into being, rebutting the decline narrative that sees later life as devitalized and sad. The long midlife, as I call it, was touted as vibrant, economically valuable, younger, older, better than you think. 80 was the new 60. Remember that? Unfortunately, when the COVID crisis came, pro-aging could not provide a strong counter narrative. In gerontology itself, ageism was scarcely yet a keyword. That, of course, is changing. And anti-ageism lacked a movement. Slide 10, please. Unmournable bodies. Grieving is human, but who is worth of grief is something we learn. Who is worthy of grief is something we learn. Many categories of people have been or can be constructed as unmournable. The process of mourning cannot begin socially if the group in question is considered of less worth than other human beings. Black Lives Matter is the response to one such deadly construction based on a long history of racist othering. Othering is the universal context of discriminations. Ageism's own vicious lethality had already struck us through biases in medicine and law. Living in the fourth age was indeed seen as abjectly near to death, but that othering referred then only to people over, say, 80, who were frail. Euthanasia was legally already understandable if it meant only dependent older women. Even before 2020, I'm saying, some heavy foundation for treating older deaths without alarm or outrage had been set in concrete molds. Slide 9. I can read it. After March 2020, the unmournable framed as doomed. When the pandemic struck in early 2020, the panicky responses transformed the duty to die. Before, as I have just argued, our leaving the scene of life had been a bad wish, a contested, lampoonable wish that could not be operationalized unless people like me, my age, refused to be treated. And then in a few months in 2020, hate speech against old people turned blatant, semi-official, and potentially deadly. Bergamo, Italy, at the peak of the ventilator crisis in March, first gave the duty to die a global field of action. It probably isn't true, as reported in mid-April, that the worst hit hospitals enforced a cutoff age of 65 for intensive care. We ought to make sure we really know that. But the Italian story nevertheless conveyed that older lives mattered less to the deciders. And then US conditions began to mirror the Bergamo context. Given the much publicized shortage of ventilators, scarcity was no longer just tax and sex and job related, but life-threatening. Almost overnight, no hostile person had to urge older people to refuse the luck of long life voluntarily. Originally too strong to die, we were, it suddenly became obvious, too weak to live. The next slide, please. And thus, those who are doomed to die are not worth saving. This rise in ageism, I'm quoting now, this rise in ageism has been manifest in the proliferation of labels such as frailty and vulnerability. A distinguished gerontologist at the University of Manchester, Chris Phillipson, wrote me in April about the same disturbing trend in the UK. Quote, much used pre-COVID, but now the labels are applied routinely to anyone over 65, 70, profoundly disempowering without question. A huge percentage of the population, including working people, was suddenly removed wholesale from the positive third age, as gerontologists call the long midlife, to the fourth age, abjectly near to death. The cheery saying, 80 is the new 60, evaporated. Major figures in some popular discourses found our alleged weakness and deadly fate useful. A lieutenant governor in Texas said on Fox News that we should be willing to take a chance on our survival for the sake of the economy, we older people. Such deaths of meatpackers and care aides too would not matter in a resurrected economy. You have heard some version of this fascistic fantasy from your own governor. The sardonic meme, okay boomer, from the fall of 2019, as early as March 20, was replaced by a murderously gleeful hashtag, boomer remover, trending on social media. In tweets, Brad Meisner, an interdisciplinary gerontologist, found, quote, clear themes of population cleansing. Only old people die is still so much taken as fact that some younger people feel free to put themselves at risk, and protesters complain that their livelihoods are at risk, their fun curtailed merely to protect the old. We don't care whether you live or die. That was the message. To be sure, much unprogrammed loving kindness has been shown me, I am almost 80, and others in this harsh time. Stores provide special shopping hours. Grandchildren say they love us on FaceTime. Adult children gather outside to blow kisses. The attempt to protect older lives mostly makes me feel protected, except perhaps in some nightmares. Ageism in bits and pieces of some kind is taken more seriously by some media, as the lengthening list of my Google alert show. I have a Google alert for ageism, and it's changed a lot. But special protection also elevates youth supremacy, further lowering our status. One friend my age said in early March she was so anxious she could scarcely breathe. She had previously felt the menace of sexism and racism and classism, but not until now, ageism. Half of 7,000 participants in a University of Michigan survey in May felt the federal government does not care about older adults. Devetta Brooks, age 75, who has heart failure and macular degeneration, and like 1.6 million Americans, lives in high-risk, low-income housing, said, "With all the things happening in the US, this is what senior lives don't matter looks like." Some older adults vocally resent being prematurely shoved along from their pleasant long midlife into the allegedly decrepit fourth age category because it ages them. Well, we should all resent the shove because it makes us seem expendable. The evil consequences of treating us as moribund have mounted. The healthier and more able seem to have a more legitimate right, as if rights were not supposed to be equal to live. And this became explicit in April of 2020. So the next slide is the next layer, the triage guidelines. Ageist negligence permitting the medical profession had been widespread before COVID. Older people had long complained that in conventional medical appointments, their doctors ignored them, instead preferring to address their adult children. Go by yourself. When ventilators first appeared grievously necessary and scarce in April, already existing ageism fed into triage deliberations. Triage means that some receive lesser access to treatment. Setting proper criteria is crucial for avoiding injustice, guilt, and tragedy. In the history of military triage, equality became valued above other principles. Since the United States does not have a national health service, which must stand by one universal ethical standard, the triage guidelines are the only semi-official codes the US has. So state commissions and bioethicists rushed to suggest guidelines or to update existing ones. And access to the ventilator in particular was a proxy measure for who counts in society. When age is a proxy for exclusion, guidelines also work implicitly against the 60% of Americans with chronic illnesses, against people with long disabilities, as well as people of color and low-income people with pre-existing conditions that may arise from cumulative disadvantage. Dr. Michelle Holmes, a Harvard epidemiologist, wrote in May, schemes using point scales to penalize older Americans and prioritizing those in better physical condition, automatically would put marginalized groups at a huge disadvantage. Dr. Holmes advocated a lottery for all those tied in score, meaning with an equal likelihood of survival. I also advocated a lottery. Instead, the University of Pittsburgh guidelines, a model for many states, do not mince words. The tiebreaker should be age. These guidelines give priority to younger patients within these age groups, 12 to 40, and then other age groups after that. Gut-wrenching, the Boston Globe commented on April 7th. The Pittsburgh document calls this priority for the young the life cycle principle. An article in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine argued for giving priority to those who are worst off, in the sense of being at risk of dying young and not having a full life. Now, some triage guidance considers an individual's estimated remaining number of years of life and other factors that take age into account. The Johns Hopkins criteria for treatment ask for no more than 1 year of potential life. Well, this respects strong people in their 90s. I have a dear aunt who is 99. At 79, I assert that my life is worth no more than that of my aunt and no less than that of a 29-year-old. A 1 year criterion or more or less respects people who suffer from health inequalities. And in a society that has lacked Medicare for all for the entire 60 years of Medicare's existence, burdened by racism, market-driven capitalism, and small government ideology, injustice, as well as ageism, is built into any crisis standard of care that prioritizes highest long-term survival. Well, where bias rules, triage becomes criminal. In a crisis, ethical decision makers going case by case must fight every societal bias they have absorbed. Training for medical personnel must include not only clinical guidance in geriatrics, but awareness about triggers for implicit prejudices. When curricular change, expanded empathy spreading can revise practices. Slide 13, the last, I think it's toward age justice, the obstacles. Yeah, I guess we don't need that anymore. Let me summarize. Something frightening has been revealed already about how ageist othering has been deployed, building on the earlier foundation of the duty to die. Trolls deliver hate speech against older people, called boomers. Semi-official triage crisis guidelines ratchet up hate into decision-making. Add to that the spectacle of politicians asking some body of people to sacrifice themselves so younger people's jobs can return. The numbing numbers of the older dead, the median age of decedents, 78 or 80, the staggeringly high death toll as age goes up, has been so often repeated that the stereotype may be ingrained. Old people are expectably frail. Oh, there is another slide. I think we have one more. An entire nation has learned, certainly without understanding, that the later life course, including dying, is a construction undergoing radical reconstruction, that our doom is part of the strange, new, abnormal. Many missing people among the extra dead were betrayed by government institutions that should have driven resources toward them. As the epidemic waxes again and the US economy fails the needy, what will the next phase bring? Will care homes continue to be underfunded and forgotten? Reopening the economy state by state threatens to exacerbate middle ageism. With jobs more scarce, we can observe the silent expulsion from the workforce of so-called boomers, and we can expect a return to highlighting their alleged deficiencies. Finally, in late May, when the first grim landmark, that was 100,000, when the first grim landmark was reached, came the first media recognition of the need to mourn collectively. Obituary pages do not suffice. The genre is intrinsically individualistic, but any public memorial may still fail to capture the shockingly grave loss of so many elders at once, matriarchal and patriarchal generations in a nation once proud of its longevity. If a nation cannot respect the importance of those lives on a par with the lives of any others, we are deprived in uncountable ways. A society sickens when the public suddenly assumes that certain categories, whether people of color, people with disabilities, women, migrants, prisoners, or older adults, are less than human. Can injustice be rectified in such circumstances? Susan Flory, a UK podcaster and anti-ageist, said in a podcast interview, "We are far from having flattened the curve on the virus of ageism. How can systemic social viruses, ageism in this case, with its inherent sexism, racism, classism, ableism, dementism, be undone? Can we trust that our lives will attain even prior levels of social dignity and value?" Well, I think my talk should end now. To hear from you at home, the next slide just says the reckonings and yes, end ageism any way you can. So I think maybe the conversation could partly be about the reckonings and ending ageism. And then I just want briefly to see the last slide again. Senexa, crone goddess of reckoning. Yes, thank you so much. You've been just a wonderful audience.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was just a phenomenal talk. We are getting some comments in the chat, but I'll encourage people to put their comments and questions into the Q&A. I did want to just call attention to a few things that were going on in the chat during your talk. So Cressida Hayes, who is a philosopher in the political science department, posted the quote from our premier that I sent to you by email earlier. He said the average age of COVID-19 related fatalities in Alberta is 84. The average life expectancy in the province is 83. And the vast majority of those who we've lost to COVID-19 were not only the average age of 84, but they had one or more chronic health conditions or comorbidities. So that's our Premier Jason Kenney. It's a lovely illustration of what you've been talking about. Aaron posted the stats that have been collected by a journalist whose name is Nora Laredo in Canada. She keeps a spreadsheet, updated regularly, and of the 9,297 deaths in Canada due to COVID, 7,629 were in institutions like long-term care facilities. And you may know, although I do know that the US media is not good at covering Canadian content, that at one point in the spring, the Premier of Quebec requested from the federal government that the Canadian military go into long-term care homes because they were in such chaos, to try to assist with the care of residents. So, and many people are just saying that this has been a phenomenal talk, but I invite questions. So I'm gonna give you a question from Michelle Marr, who is our current chair, and she writes, Margaret, you mentioned that in the early days of COVID, anti-ageism lacked a movement. Would she say that this is really still the case? What does an anti-ageism movement look like?
Yes, well, we had one in the United States, Maggie Kuhn's Grey Panthers. It had, I think, 40,000 members at its height, and they were all across the United States. And while that existed, I think people felt there was a center or a nexus probably that not only respected older people, but that you could attach yourself to theoretically and politically. And there were chapters, local chapters. Now, New York City has a local chapter, and I think it does some actions, but I haven't heard of anything. I mean, no, I don't think there's a movement. I don't. I think there's a lot of anti-ageism in age studies in gerontology. I do see that. I see that there are many more articles that you can read. GSA is sending them out that are about specific aspects of the COVID experience. The overviews, I mean, I said this, it could take a long time before we really have the kind of overview we need. I mean, I've tried what could be done studying from February to May. I think the first draft of history, we need the first draft of history, first of all, before I think we'll get a movement. I wish I could say I see signs of it from, I mean, if we've had 100,000 deaths of people in nursing homes, their children would be a natural source of a movement. But they're grieving. I mean, I don't think we can expect a movement to come from them. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see what, reckonings. I mentioned the Holyoke, Massachusetts Veterans Hospital. Two indictments have come down for that. Now, indictments focus the attention on criminal behavior, but there are crimes that are not indictable. I mean, there are crimes of omission, there are crimes of neglect, there are crimes that nobody knows about, but that cause deaths. I think we need to keep in mind that these reckonings go up to the top and they go down to the people who should have uttered warnings in the nursing homes. I mean, we have there was a great piece in the Globe. They did a series of 3, and the middle one, the second one, was about a particular nursing home, and it explained it in such detail that it was heartrending. And of course, it had been understaffed long before, even though it was a top-rated place, it was understaffed. So I mean, we are able to understand how these sins of omission and commission occur. But there's something I omitted, and maybe it's time to find it again, about what the federal government did. Never mind. I'm not going to be able to find it rapidly. I know I moved away from the question about whether there would be a movement considerably.
A lot of people, again, just encourage you all, if you have questions or comments, to use the Q&A rather than the chat. There's a lot going on in the chat at the moment, but several people have called attention to the Raging Grannies. We have Raging Grannies in several parts of Canada. I know it's an international movement. We have a very active chapter here in Edmonton. So I suppose that's one really good example of a feminist anti-aging movement. I used to teach a course on Canadian feminist activism, and so I taught the Raging Grannies, and the students really loved that. So that's interesting. There's a question which I think is quite a good one in the chat from Malin Fours, and she writes, what are your thoughts on the psychoanalytic dynamics behind ageism? Everyone could get old, but white people don't become Black or male, female, although of course, we recognize transgender experience. So the category differs from other kinds of social justice angles. I mean, I think the question here is that we all become old, and perhaps we fear aging, that's part of the kind of psychoanalytic dynamics behind aging. Do you have any thoughts on that, Margaret?
Fear ageism, not aging.
Well, that fear,
I mean, that's been a slogan of mine for a long time.
Yeah.
It's not that there is not a long conversation to be had about the psychoanalytic belief. I mean, I think when I first started thinking about age, I was just, I was put off by the biology and the psychoanalysis of the life course. And I, and certainly there are many social reasons to fear aging. The social reasons have actually grown worse. So people are poorer as they get older. Women are even poorer. The people can't retire. They have to work. Some of them are going to have to work, you know, as long as they live. Um, in the United States, the relentless attacks on Social Security make everybody looking forward to getting onto Social Security extremely nervous and anxious and whatnot. So, I mean, there, as I say, there's a longer conversation to be had, but if you fear aging, there's a good argument to be made, a theoretical argument, to figure out why you fear aging. And I know I sound just like a sociologist and not like a psychologist when I say fear ageism rather than aging. I mean, I just think it would be useful if we just took 10 or 20 years and just understood as a society why people may fear aging and how that is connected to the ageism of the society. So there's my hashtag again. It's not meant to be rude. It is meant to just turn our heads in a slightly different direction.
Indeed, I think that's really important. Someone in the chat just commented about a notorious situation in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, at a long-term care home. There have been now 2 reports released into the problems in this particular long-term care home. It's called Northwood, and 53 residents died in that care home. Now, as you may know, in Atlantic Canada, there's a bubble, and travel in and out of the 4 provinces is very restricted. There were hardly any cases. I think there's, you know, just a handful of cases in all of the 4 provinces, but you know, there was this incredible lapse in care of residents at that home. And Carolyn says that people in Halifax have been on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation talking about the loss of their parents who were living at Northwood. People are angry in Halifax, she says. So yeah, I'm wondering, there's also a lot of comments, like, you know, someone, Carolyn comments that her retirement may well depend on whether or not there still is US Social Security. Like this, this, you know, in your comments too about, you know, vulnerability, population cleansing and so on, make me think about how the interrelationship between, you know, ageism, neoliberalism, and COVID. I was wondering if you might want to talk a little bit more about that, because, you know, of course, you know, the form of the ideal neoliberal citizen is a self-managing citizen. So we've all been taught to now to abhor vulnerability, right, and dependence. And to the extent that aging signifies dependence and interdependence, you know, it really is opposed to this normative neoliberal self-managing citizen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please, thanks. That's a great topic. When I was talking about the duty to die, I cut some of the examples of that neoliberal discourse. It was about the money. I mean, it was about the cost of these people. It was the Nazi math. You don't get that unless you have a kind of constructed scarcity, or pretend scarcity, or potential scarcity, and it's often politicians who create that. But I was quoting bioethicists because I think it's so shocking when you get a neoliberal discourse about the duty to die from people who are supposed to be ethicists. And the other one was Ezekiel Emanuel, And he had a piece in the Atlantic about why people should stop being treated after 75. Now, it gets worse, actually. I've written about this quite a lot. So, 2008 was a global meltdown of economies that hit the United States also very hard, very hard. I mean, started probably by our banks, and nobody got, almost nobody got caught and punished. Talk about no reckonings. Anyway, President Obama, his grandmother needed an extra hip. I mean, she had cancer, and I guess she was, people say, dying, but cancer, you can live a long time with certain kinds of cancer, and she needed a hip. And they decided, yes, they would give her a new hip. They weren't going to pretend that she didn't need it. But he said in an interview with the New York Times, is this sustainable? Now, that's the president of the United States wondering if his grandmother's care is sustainable. So you can get relatively liberal people uttering neoliberal sound bites. Sustainable came from that discourse because it was the recovery period, and he felt that well, who knows how he felt. You don't want to attribute motives to people, but I think, and he said, if Medicare would pay for it, I would have paid for it myself. Right, okay. Well, we must keep Medicare because people cannot afford to pay for their hip operations without it. And I'll say something else. Joe Biden is running for president in the United States in a Democratic ticket, and he wants to expand Medicare. I think that's the way it will go, from age 65, where it begins now, to age 60. Well, it really should go down to 55, because people between the ages of 55 and 65 in the United States are very sick. I knew that, and many other people knew that pre-COVID. I quoted a statistic in one of my books that in that decade, 55 to 65, 11.7% of the uninsured died every year. That was a shocking statistic. Pre-COVID, those are people they just can't get healthcare. They couldn't get healthcare. It was before Obamacare, but still, it's not, we need a much better system. We really do need Medicare for all that is adequately funded. And well, a lot is resting on this election. But what we're hoping is that we'll have less, if Biden wins, we'll still have arguments about how to fund things and whether we can fund things. The United States is not a strong nation so much economically anymore, a whole other topic. But you fear that when there is this kind of scarcity, the debates get uglier, and the neoliberal kinds of vocabularies do tend to come back. So that's one reason why I think that ageism may not disappear simply because we know more about it. We're learning more about it. Thank you for that question.
Denise Nepfer in the chat says folks in disability studies are less shocked that by that thinking among bioethicists. I think that's a really important comment.
Well, thank Denise. I know her, and I value her opinion, and she is certainly correct. She is certainly correct. I think a lot of what I've said is what I'm hoping. It's shocking. It should be shocking. Let it be shocking, but it's not surprising. In other words, if you I used the term cumulative disadvantage. That's Dale Danifer's term. if you've been aware of cumulative disadvantage before this, you certainly have known about inequality, not just in the United States, but everywhere. But it just so happens that in the United States, it's either the top inequality in the world or we're in the top three. And inequality has just been a disaster for healthcare. And I'm sure there are many people in the audience who know a lot more about healthcare in these circumstances than I do. And
Well, and in fact, Iris Vargas in the chat has commented, I'm a medical student at St. James School of Medicine, and I believe conversations like this one should be held at medical schools. Medical students should be exposed to these conversations.
yes, absolutely. Bless you for saying that. We in the United States, we now have the idea that police should start having conversations about their implicit bias. And I already mentioned training for medical people about their implicit bias. And we know, well, I think we do know, that many people who've worked in hospitals during the COVID epidemic are grieving at some of the choices that they have to make. But we don't know which choices they're grieving. So are they grieving the loss of older people? Are they grieving the loss of people of color? Do they really know do they know their implicit biases? I mean, there's so much age. There was a book that everybody used to read in medicine when you became a resident, and it was called something like City of God, House of God, I think. And it was like the Bible for residents who went through American medical schools. And it had an expression, Gomers, get em out of my emergency room. And that meant old people. Gomers were old people with chronic conditions, multiple conditions, that residents simply felt they were unable to handle emotionally as well as medically, and perhaps psychologically as well as medically and emotionally. I'm told that it's a little better. I'm told that people don't read the book anymore, or they don't believe it, or it's a good book. They get a lot out of it. They don't know geriatrics. Geriatrics is not taught in American medical schools, in very many medical schools. It ought to be taught in every one. It should be routine that when you do your rounds, you have a geriatrics round. Some people love their geriatrics rounds when they get to them. They decide that they love old people. That always makes me laugh a little bit. Yes, love me, I'm old. But okay, love old people, sure. There's a nice one of those, they call them benign stereotypes. No, they love old people. They love working with old people because old people are interesting, often interesting. Have lots to say about their lives, and they have very good relations with younger people, and actually often rather like residents in emergency rooms, and get, particularly if they're in a community where the geriatric residents come visit, that's when real wonderful relationships can flourish. Yes, thanks so much for the question about medical training. Yes, and implicit bias. I think, I hope everybody here knows what implicit bias is. I've used the term, and I have said that in language it can become explicit, and that's what we've been seeing in this worsening of the COVID era. We've had more explicit language, and it's harder to respond to. I think we're not really prepared, even we're not prepared. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. And many of you, I imagine, are teaching this year, and maybe some of you teach the subjects in which you could actually introduce some of this material about anti-ageism, in all its diversity and interest, um, and and see how students may love this material. I mean, they may really lap it up. There's really no reason why students who have become um, interested in feminism and anti-racism shouldn't find shouldn't find ageism an interesting topic, and shouldn't find anti-ageism a theme and a social justice issue like so many that they have absorbed recently. I mean, our students are turning, many of them are just remarkable people who have been in the United States. Is where I know them most. I mean, now many of them talk about socialism in a way that was never possible before. Never possible before 2016, before Bernie Sanders, before before there was a time we couldn't even say the word capitalism. So yes, trust your students, teach anti-ageism.
I just wanted to let you know that there's a few more questions in the Q&A. We'll try and get through some of them, but we are now at 10 to 5 in Edmonton, and for Margaret, it's 10 to 7, so I can imagine she's getting a little tired. I'll ask one from Ryan Backer, who said, he's referring to the quote that Anne mentioned. Anne said, "Ageism is the least censored and most acceptable and unnoticed of the cruel prejudices." And he says, "It strikes me as pitting ageism against other isms at a time when the movement for Black lives is gaining so much attention and the movement against ageism is so lacking. Do you think this is an appropriate strategy?" Perhaps Ryan is really asking if we need more of a kind of coalitional strategy that acknowledges the nuanced forms of intersectionality that you've been referencing.
Yes, I mean, I could just leave it at that. That seems like such a good answer. I mean, I started by saying that that ageism affects everybody who grows older or who is about to grow older. And so I think all the social biases are intimately tied to it or subsumed in it. I think one of the things I hate the hierarchy of injustices. That's not where I'm going. And I don't think that any anti-ageist wants to do that. On the contrary, I mean, I think Black Lives Matter is teaching us what a movement can accomplish, though. I mean, I think I am, what shall I say? I wish we had some of its energy. I wish we had some of its wrath. I don't see that. I see, I would like it to include Black Lives, Old Lives Matter. I'll say that. I see no reason why the Black Lives Matter movement or the Black Voters Matter movement, for that matter, can't include Old Lives Matter, because though their family members are also dying in nursing homes. Remember, I said it was weird the way, the press talked about the nursing homes and you didn't know whether it was white people in them or people of color or what. You don't know whether they're women or men. I mean, the data is so peculiar, but certainly, oh yes, the West Baltimore example, where that Baptist minister, he had people, that was all people of color, and they didn't have a single, he just protected them. And I want to tell a story just because I love this story. The Reverend, somebody said to him, when did you lock down your home? He said, as soon as President Trump said 15 people had died and it was going to go away right away, he said, I locked them down. So, I mean, we have a lot to learn from people doing it right. There are other places that did it right. And we have a lot to learn from Black Lives Matter if we can organize a movement. But I do want to say something else about that. It's about the numbing effect of what's been happening to us. I think many people are simply numbed, and if you listen to a whole talk like this, maybe numbing is part of the emotion that you are feeling, and that you can't reach your outrage because it is just too overwhelming, and it doesn't seem to have enough of an encouraging counter narrative, or or a sense of solidarity. I mean, I must say, I feel a sense of solidarity just from the fact that hundreds of people turned up for this talk. I didn't expect that. I mean, that's a small personal sign for me, but it's also a sign that there are people interested all over the world in age studies, in anti-ageism, um, and and I think they will be the activists in every single way they can think of.
So Margaret, maybe that's a very nice place to end, but I'm gonna just raise one more point, and I'm gonna put together a few questions that have been asked, and these questions are sort of getting at like the segregation of old people in long-term care, and of course that, you know, as a protectionist measure, as you were just talking about during the pandemic, you know, people the closing off of long-term care homes, you know, may have preserved lives, but it also plausibly created trauma for the residents who were cut off from their loved ones. So there's a question, a comment about that, but also a question which I think is quite interesting. And, you know, I've seen a few news stories about this, about, you know, for example, university students living together with older people. So breaking down that segregation. Another comment is saying, or question is saying, what do you think about the model of seniors homes merging with university residences or daycares to break down those age divides? Like, it does seem like segregation is part of the problem. It's part of the foundation for ageism.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, those are good. Those are not only good suggestions, they actually happen all the time. Um, and when my mother was living nearby in a residential community, Harvard was nearby, and I somehow got hold of a young woman who was an undergraduate, and she came to have lunch with my mother once a week. Well, I mean, it was only supposed to happen once, but then it went on happening. I mean, the food was good. My mother was charming. She told great stories. She was a great joke teller. I mean, all of that is true. And Sarah Lamb at Brandeis, which is where my center is, has a course that has a component in it in which students who want to have to, it's called Sages and Seekers. I love that. And they have 6 or 7 visits over the course of the semester with people who live not in a nursing home, but in they belong to Bali, which is this educational component that about 100 universities in the country have it. And I mean, this could happen anywhere. It doesn't need to have a Bali classroom, but those people write a statement up to their sage at the end of the time. And it's invariably how marvelous it was to get to know that particular person. And that's not about loving old people. That's that particular person, that mentor, that marvelous, interesting. My God, what a life course they've had. I mean, the quotations, I quote from this in Ending Ageism. They're just wonderful. So yes, all of that should be happening, and I don't see that it's not an expensive thing to happen. Sarah Lamb students get some course credit for extra course credit for doing it, but it doesn't seem to be. It's it's not like money. It's they just have. It's a great experience, and yes, I mean intergenerationalism is if we get through this, when we get through this, and I hope it will be soon, I think all of those programs should start up again. Um, the Reverend in West Baltimore, he's having porch visits. He started having porch visits. Eventually, he felt it was safe enough to do that. And I think there are a lot of ways that even that people in nursing homes who are being protected can also have some kind of interactions with if you have enough aides. I mean, this is another thing that he did in West Baltimore. He got the aides to come in full time, and maybe he even hired some more aides. And when you do that, when you have people full time, then they do get to know the biographies of the people that they're living with through conversation. And we call this a conversation. It's a kind of you've made it as much of a conversation as it could possibly be, Lise. Those conversation is where the future lies, and it won't all be reckonings. It will be overcomings and new creations and human warmth and creativity, and through all of that we will have some way of recovering, and perhaps we'll even figure out how to have the memorials that this moment needs.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Well, Margaret, I want to thank you for this. Has just been a really phenomenal talk. In the chat and in the Q&A, people are just expressing their deep gratitude, and many people are saying, I want to be able to listen to this again. This is so important. So this has been really, really a wonderful conversation. And even I should say, before COVID, when I initially approached Margaret, she had suggested doing it remotely. And at that point I was like, how's that going to work? But it's worked so well. And I think it's really opened up your talk and your thoughts to a much wider audience. So in fact, I'm very grateful for this format, although I'd love to be able to give everyone a big hug right now. So anyway, we are going to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you for attending. This has been a wonderful conversation, but I'm going to ask the panelists just to stay on for a few minutes after we stop broadcasting. So thank you for coming to the Dallas Cullen Lecture. And please watch next year for our lecture. Perhaps it will also be online. This has been a wonderful format and a wonderful first remote lecture. Thanks to Margaret.
Thank you so much. Thank you.